All right, I got a heavy one for you guys. I wanted to tell you guys about this Dan Carlin hardcore history podcast called Painfotainment. This is a Blitz edition episode, so if you're not familiar with Dan Carlin and hardcore history, what he really does is he looks at history in a less academic sense, but through a storytelling sense, and he does really months of research. He has a really interesting approach to scheduling where he just puts out content whenever it's ready, whenever he's done enough research, whenever he has all the facts. And he tries to look at these different periods in time and almost put us there on the ground and understanding it from the people's perspective of people who lived through it. And it's called hardcore because he gets into some pretty hardcore subject matter. As you know, history could be pretty bloody. There was a lot of slavery, there's a lot of executions, and this episode, Painfotainment, is less about a particular period in time, but it is analyzing this idea of how we have used pain for entertainment for, I guess, thousands of years, and what that means, and kind of exploring this whole idea. This episode is 273 minutes, which is over 3 hours. So this is not for the faint of heart. This is basically half of a novel worth of listening to, but one of the things I can do with this series is tell you guys a little bit about this, so you might pique your curiosity to check it out. In this episode, Carlin, he looks at a couple of different periods in time, like the gladiatorial games they used to do in which people are pitted against each other and also pitted against animals for the entertainment of the crowd. We look at lynchings, we look at burning. And as we're going through these different time periods, we spend a lot of time looking at the dark ages of medieval Europe, the 1500s and 1600s, and it's almost impossible to look at this period of time and what was happening to people without understanding the religious context in which these things happened. We've all heard about the Salem witch trials and how people got burned at the stake for potentially being a witch and all of that. So one of the things I found most interesting in this podcast is, yes, he does dive into the specific kinds of torture that would happen, such as breaking on the wheel, in which they might tie your limbs to a wagon wheel, essentially, and maybe beat you with sticks and hammers over it. They might wrap your limbs up into the spokes of the wheel and just basically stretch out this process as long as possible. And what's crazy about it is these events were essentially the tailgating party of their day, meaning people would make an entire event of it. You might have 1,000 to 10,000 people coming in from neighboring towns and neighboring villages to see this person, and if they tried to destroy the church, or if heresy, or if they tried to take down the prince, then it becomes an even juicier tale. But people are hanging out for hours before the event even starts. People are drinking, there's jugglers, there's musicians, people are stopping by the bar. They're making an entire day of it, and of course people bring their kids to watch the execution. One of the things Carlin does at this point is he looks at these different periods in time and then he contrasts them with today, meaning essentially we like our violence staged. We like it in films, we like it in movies, we like it to be fake, but a certain part of our brain still gets off on the same idea of watching pain unfold on the screen. You could look at Game of Thrones, look at Cersei specifically. There is something about human nature which is very interested in retribution. So I think Mel Gibson really understands this well in his films, and he knows how to play off of our human desire to watch violence unfold on the screen. One of my favorite parts of this podcast is how Dan Carlin finds a first-person account, essentially the journal of the executioner, and the life that the executioner lived during the Dark Ages. He was essentially ostracized from society, from community, but he was also imbued with this power where basically if the executioner touched you on the shoulder, you were cursed. You were almost cursed by the hand of God, as like this was a very mysterious, interesting man. And so he was very well compensated, but he would live on the outskirts of community. So it's an interesting look at like, what does wealth mean if you have money but nobody wants to talk to you, nobody wants to be your friend, and you're pushed to the margins of society. So eventually executioners would often end up marrying into the families of other executioners, and this would go on down through the generations, and then you essentially have this other caste or this other group of society in which execution has become part of the family business. I think my biggest takeaway from this podcast is, and it's a long one and it's pretty gruesome. I would say this is like an X-rated podcast. There's some pretty intense stuff. This is not for the faint of heart or the faint of stomach. It's really just to be happy that we live in modern times and that we are becoming more civilized. We are becoming less brutal as a society. We still have incarceration, which doesn't really rehabilitate people, but we've come a long way since the Dark Ages. It's easy to look at something that happened 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago and say, oh, well, these were barbarians, they were uneducated people, they had no understanding of what was happening around them. But you look at just as recently as 1916, we had Jesse Washington as a black man who was falsely accused of rape and violence, and he was lynched, in Waco, about an hour from where I am shooting this video. Now, what's interesting about it is this is a form of mob violence in which they did not want to let the judicial system carry out justice. They essentially took justice into their own hands, and everyone in the town gathered around to watch this and, spit on this guy and throw food on him and dole out some of the punishment themselves. So I think it's important for us to understand mob violence and how we can break out of that, how we can move forward as a society. This is a podcast that'll give you a lot of context for history, where we are today, where we've come from, and how things are really getting a lot better. All right, podcast people, keep your buds in. I'd love to hear what you guys think about Dan Carlin, Hardcore History. If there's any podcasts you'd like me to review, leave a comment below, and I'll catch you on the next episode.